I want to touch really briefly on public versus private because the book hasn't gone into it a lot and it's come up a few times. So when we looked at Greek rhetoric, rhetoric was really focused on public spaces, public delivery in public forums, mostly for men with power, especially politicians, especially related to politics. So we had the three ways that rhetoric existed within situations for Greek rhetoric. And even, so then we had the Christianization, and rhetoric was really basically only existing within the church and in times when we were trying to convert people. And then we've got scientific discoveries reimagining all of this rhetoric, but it was mostly men in public forums sharing science information. And so for the huge majority, up until the late 1800s, rhetoric is seen as public. It only exists within public. When we get into the epistemology, which we read in an earlier chapter, and we start thinking, well, rhetoric helps us make meaning. Like, it's the lens that we use to argue about things, or the lens that we use to make sense of things that are told to us. And persuasion can happen in private spaces, they can happen in homes. We can persuade ourselves. We start to see that rhetoric extends into into private spaces. So public spaces really are, and this is a Habermas theory, but Habermas is heavily critiqued for being a Nazi, which is true. It was a thing. Yay, 1940s. Not good. But there's still some real important truth to the theory and to the conceptualization. Public and who has access to public spaces. If we look at American history, especially prior to the 1960s, even post-abolition, post the removal of slavery in America, we still had restrictions on who was allowed in certain public spaces. And if you restrict who is allowed and who can be there, and who, based on the body, is qualified to be there just based on body and nothing else, you really start to restrict who has access to rhetoric and rhetorical theory, and who has access to ways of knowing because of that. And that's where the public and the private sphere ideas become really, really important and really, really powerful for feminism. We're going to see it with alternative rhetorics in the next chapter as well. Who has access to ways of knowing based on what spaces they have access to in public and what spaces they have access to in private. And as soon as we start asking those questions, we have a lot of things that we need to consider with gender, with race, with socioeconomic status. There's so much data in the United States about how the zip code that you're born into is a bigger indicator of your success in college than anything. That says a lot about the ways of knowing that children have access to, even when they have public school available to them, because public school is supposed to be available to everybody here in the United States. What kind of public schooling and what does that mean? Okay, so public and private sphere are really about, so we're going to ignore the Habermas stuff and drama. We're really looking at what ways of knowing do different people have access to based on gender, socioeconomic status. So socioeconomic status is class and race. Those are the underlying tensions that feminists are starting to deal with. It's messy across the waves, but those are the tensions that they're dealing with. Who has access to how we know?